Without any further ado, I would like to welcome Janice Minott.
Hello, hello. I see a lot of familiar faces. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Anne. You know, this assignment has been great for me because it made me look at my experience sort of through a different lens, rather than just focusing on all of our adventures, focusing on what it brought to me as a woman and my relationship with other women. So here we go. As you mentioned, I published my memoir. If you want to read it, it's out there in the lobby. And it was a story of our family adventures in a country that at the time few people could locate on a map. Tonight, I will focus mostly on my experiences. The first time Peace Corps volunteers went to Kabul in 1962, Group 1 consisted of 6 women and 3 men. 3 nurses, 1 mechanic, and the rest teachers. One of the teachers wrote in his memoir about Kabul in 1962 was a city unlike any I ever seen or have seen since. A few square blocks reflected the 20th century, but most seemed to belong to the world of 100 years earlier, and large sections would not have been out of place in the Middle Ages. I think those of you who were here to see the slides would agree. It was just the kind of place we planned to work in someday. Through the years, Walter, my husband, now my ex-husband, was offered jobs in Cambodia and Congo, but always I was about to give birth, so we put it off. When Peace Corps came on the scene, we assumed we would not be eligible as we had 3 children under the age of 10. However, Walter's name turned up on a talent search. We were interviewed in December of 1965 and on our way 6 months later in June. The confirmation letter from Washington said, "We are happy when we get a married man because then we get 2 for the price of 1. That statement wouldn't fly today, but remember when this was. I took it in stride and suggested that we reply, in your case, you're getting 5 for the price of 1. After leaving New Jersey, we visited my college roommate in Copenhagen and then landed in Tehran, where we had to stay for 2 nights. The Iranian jet flew just twice a week in Kabul. That was that little traffic. The route lay over a vast desert and also the city of Kandahar, which everybody's heard about today. It was founded by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. Afghanistan is divided in the middle by a range of 15,000-foot mountains. Before the ages of helicopters and drones, the many armies that have invaded the country through the centuries had to march around those mountains. Kabul is in a mountain valley. Pilots say the clouds around Kabul have rocks in them. But the day we landed was cloudless, brilliant day. When we descended into the valley, it felt like we were landing in an oasis, where a family of nomads was encamped in their black goatskin tents. But where was the city? Kabul then had a population of 300,000, but from the airfield, all I could see were those magnificent snow-capped peaks. Then I noticed the colored flags flapping in the fresh mountain air, and seated on the balcony of the airport building, a line of women dressed in shabri, most green, but one deep red. The ruler Zahishar had declared in 1959 that women need not be veiled, but many still wore it. Not every woman could manage to change so fast. One woman, when asked by a friend of mine, why do you wear your shagri when your husband doesn't insist on it? Her reason was, if I don't have it on, then I can't look at the men. Good reason, huh? We had been on our way for about a week, but we took a trip back in time. The ride from the airport to town was one that unsettled many newcomers. The world seemed to be populated only with men and children. There were vendors with their wares on donkeys and porters pulling loads on a two-wheeled platform called a karachi. One farmer beside the road had a team of oxen pulling a large log over a pile of wheat to thresh it. Later in the season, he would use a winnowing basket and let the wind blow away the chaff. We had just missed the northern spring migration of the nomads called Kuchis. Traditionally, their camel caravans went straight through town, but by 1966, there was a little more modern of that 20th century that had come into play, and there were a lot of taxis. And the taxis and the camels got entangled in the middle of town. So after that, they came around the outskirts of the city, right by our side door. Our garden gate was always a moment of a thrilling moment for us, because it's such an ancient way of life, one that we must have all lived at one time. We did pass one woman in Chardry on the way from the airport, seated by the roadside. We did not take this picture, this photograph, but it is a sight we saw many times. The smooth stone you see by the fold of the Chardry is her toilet paper. Donna Catherine, who had her 10th birthday the day we landed, called the Chardry a spook dress at first. Then she later changed to toilet tent. She insisted we buy one because it was absolutely impossible for a woman to find a private place to relieve herself on a road trip. There were no rest stops, roadside restaurants, or filling stations. With luck, one might find a large boulder to squat behind and hope not to attract attention. So we got Catherine a Chardry, but then my Farsi instructor told us we ran the risk of being apprehended on suspicion of kidnapping an Afghan woman, should she be seen entering our car. During the transition of the original director and his wife, Bob and Sherry, leaving and us arriving, we stayed with George and Helen, one of the younger staff families. The mission now had grown from 9 to over 200 volunteers. I learned very quickly the younger staff wives were not happy with the expectations that they would have responsibility for welcoming and hospitality and nothing else. There were few women in the Foreign Service in the 60s, and even as late as 2004, our woman ambassador to Nepal could say, until very recently, if a woman wanted to make her foreign policy views felt, her best bet was to marry a diplomat and then accidentally drop pour tea on the lap of the offending ambassador. Peace Corps was an independent agency. The volunteers lived among the people, sharing their life as much as possible. As heads of mission, we were still a part of the official family and had to appear at numerous official functions. The silver-haired gentleman in this photo is the protocol officer. He lined us up according to our importance, and we literally towed the line he had drawn at the edge of the airfield. The only agency below us was United States Information Service. Peace Corps was a novelty then. The senator here from Wyoming is obviously intrigued. This was my debut. I was doing my best imitation of the supportive two-for wife. That's true for the price, you know. There was one embassy wife who went her own way and was resented as not supporting the official family. As the Ami Ateshi's wife, they were often both traveling within the country, but she was also off on her own a lot. An avid horsewoman, she also drove a horse carriage. She was fluent in speaking and writing the classical Farsi. She accepted invitations for the proverbial cup of tea from even the poorest people living beside the road. Most American families lived behind their compound walls, only ate commissary food, and drove about in their cars. Only wealthy Afghans owned vehicles. Soon we were in a house by ourselves. The two older children immediately began to explore. They were on foot and to participate in the kite flying. The soon-to-be 6-year-old, he seemed to feel this might be just another summer trip, and we would be returning to New Jersey soon. So he clung to me a lot when it turned out that wasn't going to happen, so I finally had to explain to him that we would be going home after he had his 8th birthday. He was very thoughtful for a while, and then he said very quietly, "I believe I could be happy if I could just have a kitten." So he is a great lover of animals, and I had to train myself not to watch him hugging and kissing the street dogs that lived in the filthy alley nearby. You know, they say dogs have oxytocin that increases your immune function. Well, that must have worked on him because he's the only one of us who didn't get amoebas, even after kissing all those dogs. I set about setting up a home. Sherry, my predecessor, had sent a long list of things to bring, all your children's things because nothing is available, and various odd items like an ice cream maker and lots of vanilla. She suggested I keep Anwar, the cook. He was an excellent baker, thus the need for vanilla. She didn't say much except that he was a Hazara, a Shiite. Meant nothing to me at the time. Now there are two kinds of language to learn in a new culture, the spoken language and the silent language. The silent language made up of our unconscious patterns and assumptions. Anwar and I bumped against those walled-off places in ourselves right away. Our first dinner party was for 30 Peace Corps nurses who were scheduled to work in the provinces. We used to call them the singing nurses. They eventually made up a song about washing patients without soap. I worked alongside Anwar in the kitchen, mostly concocting my first alcoholic punch. As we were finishing up, I thought he looked like he'd slept in his clothes. Of course, I learned later, Afghan houses were furnished with carpets and toshaks, thin futons. You took off your shoes at the door. The toshaks were arranged in daytime for sitting, eating, playing cards. At night, they were arranged for sleeping. You lay down and pulled a quilt over you. There was no such thing as pajamas. Finally, I said, "I'll finish here. You can go change your clothes." Bossy American woman that I was. Anwar did not stop working, or nor did he look up. But he was very firm. "Tomorrow you get new cook." I slipped away. Somehow I knew he would not stalk out. In the morning he waylaid Walter. Bob, the previous director, had grown up in Iran and spoke fluent Farsi, and Sherry must have left all servant problems to him. Anwar wept and said we were like mother and father to him. Walter had his hands full with his job. He basically told him, "Good, you take all your problems to mother. I don't want to hear them." At the end of the tour, he told me, "If I had to worry about the family, I would have drowned. I knew you could look after the family." And I gasped, "But he's a grown man." Then I realized that I had been promoted overnight from a twofer to a place of honor and respect, particularly as I was the mother of sons. Afghan women say that a woman with sons stands under a sheltering tree. Anwar and I had no other choice but to become a team. I asked his advice about things. He would always want to know what I paid for something I purchased, and then laugh and tell me what I should have paid. So he had really coached me to become a very good bargainer, so much so that a shopkeeper once said to me, "Germany, Elspine? Are you German?" And I said, "No, why do you think I'm German?" "Oh, because you're very sucked." So when I told Anwar, he laughed because suck is the word he used for meat, which was hard to cut. So when we needed a night guard to answer the garden gate and just to have a mail in the house during Walter's many trips back to Washington, Anwar suggested his nephew, Bakhtari, who looked to me to be about 17, 18 at the time. I felt like I'd acquired a teenage son, but Afghan culture recognizes no teenage. Anwar was worried about him having come so recently from Bamiyan to the big city of Kabul. So he asked me to keep him very busy with chores, but the boy was so smart and so energetic, I couldn't keep up, and he did get into trouble. Anwar was very upset. When he come to Kabul, boy, now man, but not good. There's a lot about Bakhtari escapades in the book, but there's no time to relate them now. I learned quickly that I must leave instructions in Farsi. Anwar was the only one of the three men in the house it took to run this household in Kabul that did what I had done single-handed at home, who knew any English. He was too proud to admit when he really hadn't understood, particularly in front of the other men who believed he was understanding. And when I got home and I was surprised and frustrated at the results, he'd say, "But you say." If it had happened the other way around, that I had misunderstood, he would have said, "Parwanese, it doesn't matter." Parwanese, along with Inshallah, if God wills it, were two expressions I heard somewhere every day. He naturally seemed to favor our oldest boy, Chris, who also loved to cook. Anwar had the time and patience to let him learn some tricks I never did. How to make pomegranate juice. I asked him recently, and he said, "Oh, you put the seeds in a silk stocking," there were no nylons at the time, "and squeeze the seeds through that." I had trouble being supplanted entirely in the kitchen because the kitchen's my favorite chore. So I sometimes tried to sneak in the afternoon when Anwar was usually having tea with a friend in his room. But I came in and there he was, and he looked up as though caught in the act and said, "Chris want cookies." One thing the children loved was his pizza, made from the dough available in every neighborhood naan-shop that made the world's best flatbread. Anwar was from the Hazara tribe, member of the Hazara tribe. His home village was Bamiyan in the remote valley where the giant Buddhas stood until being dynamited by the Taliban in 2001. The Hazaras are an ancient people and once made up the majority of the population. Popular thinking is they may be descended from the remnants left behind by the descendants of Genghis Khan. But in the 60s, they were moving to Kabul, building houses, pooling resources, and moving up the economic and social ladder. Anwar and a relative had just finished building a two-room traditional mud brick house. We all lived in them. But his was on a barren plain, not far from our house. Our neighborhood once looked the same way, we were told, before the wells were put in and the irrigated gardens. Just before Thanksgiving, his brother was getting married. I told him to take time off for the wedding celebrations, but be sure to make the pies ahead for our Thanksgiving dinner. Shortly before noon Tuesday, the groom appeared in his wedding clothes, ready to escort our whole family to the celebrations. But I was the only one home. Bakhtari forgot to relay the invitation. The two-room house was filled with women relatives. Anwar insisted that I eat first, of course. That was traditionally most hospitable people in the world. And the wives sat beside me, waving the flies away. He had taken the course fashioned by the American women for cooks. A main feature was a film about the journey of the fly from human feces in the street to dining room table. I tried my Farsi on them and they laughed good-naturedly. Then I was led into the main room and seated on the only chair, a low stool. Everyone else was seated on the floor. How I wish I had known more about these people at the time, but my sole orientation for my position was reading James Michener's Caravans. Walter said he guessed the Peace Corps just had to trust to luck in their choices of staff. At a midterm conference, a young volunteer finishing his first year serving in the Hazara broke down and wept after listening to a man talk to them about his decades of living there. It takes time to penetrate an ancient culture. People will tell you what they feel you want to hear until you've had that third cup of tea. I felt I just scratched the surface in 22 months. But now I can click on Google and learn a few facts. The Hazaras have a distinct music of their own, do beautiful calligraphy and weave rugs, or at least they did for a time before all the wars. Still, there were many who were illiterate. I'd already noticed their women did not wear the shalwi. I particularly remember one beautiful young woman seated along the black wall in a long dress of green and scarlet. She spoke up an act with perfect poise and perfect English. Asked, "Did you bring a camera?" I felt like a fool, but I told the truth. The camera belonged to my husband. I never took pictures. At that time, one needed to use a light meter and set the setting and all that. Walter was the photographer. I was the storyteller. The bride, I guessed, was about 15. Her hands had been painted with henna, and she had on a beautiful outfit with silk pantaloons. Anwar told me the groom had to buy 5 such outfits. She was very excited and nervous and frightened, trembling. She was trying to hide under her veil and had her back to the crowd. She was obviously a dutiful daughter from a loving family. Her mother, seated on the other side of her, was nursing an infant. The mother smiled at me and seemed to be happy that day. When I saw the bride a year later, she had her own infant and was working with one of the other women in the family, cooking a meal over the wood fire on the ground. How do they cook in winter when the snow is on the ground, I wondered. I saw that the large wooden crates our sea freight arrived in had been put to good use. One is a well covering, the other is a work table. When Anwar and Abdulhamid had seen those crates, their eyes lit up. If I wasn't going to use them, could they have them? It was as if I gave them gold. I came to feel that Anwar and his nephew, to a lesser extent Abdulhamid, who Anwar confessed for who Abdulhamid for him had not so good, became my extended family. Walter told his parents, Anwar loved Janice. He was hard-working, trustworthy, and kind. When Walter was out of the country, without my even asking, he would wait until Bakhtari returned from his dinner in the bazaar before leaving to go home himself. He just naturally seemed to fall into that protective stance. One of those evenings, Chris strode up to him and gave him a hug. Anwar's eyes moistened. I was surprised how emotional Afghans were. I was used to the buttoned-up old New England style. With winter coming on, we needed a fire in the evenings. Now you're going to find out where the title of this talk comes from. So when I left one afternoon, I gave instructions to light the fire at Chobajah, 4 o'clock. There was one problem. The word for fire and the word for sun were very similar. of Tawanatish. And I used the wrong one. I had asked them to light the fire. The men began to laugh uproariously. Mem Saab wants us to light the sun! Light the sun! None of us ever forgot it. It was a magical moment. No Afghan women were given papers to work in foreign households. Only one little old lady worked as a nanny for the CIA chief. The first volunteers knew that their servants were required to report periodically to the police station what they observed in their places of employment. I find it hilarious that this little old lady might have been reporting on our head spook, as we called them. She recognized me one day in the street, since our 6-year-old Gregory biked several blocks through the Blue Mosque Bazaar to play with the 2 sons of her employer. He even called one evening to say, well, we're about to sit down to dinner. Do you want me to send Gregory home with my chauffeur? And I said, well, no, he can get home on his bicycle the same way he got there. And he said, oh, I didn't understand. You see, it was so unheard of for American children to be out in the street. So this little lady, old lady in her sharpie stopped in front of me and started talking. And I couldn't hardly hear her. I didn't know who it was. And then I thought about what Catherine said. She called it a spook dress. It was sort of like being confronted with a ghost. When she saw that I was puzzled, I could see she looked up the street, down the street, and then like a child playing peekaboo, she lifted the top, there's a top place where it's shorter, and showed me her face, a big smile, and then lifted, put it back. Now we're going to take a few minutes. I want you to listen again and listen to a few bars of the Afghan music chanted by Ustad Mawash. Ustad is a word for a master. She was the first woman to go to the musicians' quarters. It was not allowed, families didn't allow their women to go there, but she took the risk and her husband finally accompanied her. She was singing, she learned the full repertoire of Afghan music. She was singing on Kabul radio when we were there, and left during the hard times in the 90s when women could no longer sing in public. She is a legend in her country, and as a Sufi, her songs are all about love in the many various forms, sacred and secular. The title of the song we're going to hear is I Am the Girl of the Garden. I am the light of this garden. It is a song to sing to yourself. I am the beauty of this rose garden, like a cypress. I am the splendor of this garden. The thousands who pass by are bowled over by my beauty. Birds in flight caress me with their song. Hyacinths, daffodils, and eglantine envelop me in their perfume.
چونان سر کرده ای در پرده بالا عزیز من که مطربم نخواند غیر درباری به دربارم من سروی سرافرازم و مرهمی داغم من دختری باغم من سروی سرافرازم و مرهمی داغم من دختری باغم من زینت باغ و چمن و گلشن و راغم من دختری باغم
So the women were behind the compound walls and the gardens. That's why I brought up. That's why I brought up the song. I know most of you who were here earlier heard her singing. So the reason I wasn't seeing many women, that the men did the shopping and the women were behind the compound walls. One contemporary Afghan writer has insisted that it was never meant to be a prison but a garden. Still, a woman could not go outside without a male escort. My garden became a great refuge for me from the excitement and stress of learning to cope with the overwhelming male world beyond the gates. There was a garden of dahlias outside a bedroom window and also a row of mature pine trees along the back wall. When there was a breeze, they sighed exactly the way they do on the Maine coast, where I grew up. I wrote many of the letters that ended up in my memoir, seated in that garden. There were several little girls, all about the same age, in the compound directly across the street from us, and they waited for Catherine to emerge. She blended into their world so effortlessly that I recently asked her, how did you all communicate? In the international language of play, she's replied. When asked today what she learned from her time in country, she tells people the meaning of true generosity. My special friend had so little, but she took off one of her bangles and placed it on my wrist. I still have it. I've also long wondered if there were two families or two wives in that compound. There were so many children of the same age. I met one man coming and going. He was very pleasant, dressed in Western clothes even, but I never saw a woman, even in Sharpie. Catherine told me that she too wondered, so she got Chris to go up on her roof so she could see over their compound wall. Indeed, there were two moms. She then asked Anwar about it, and he gently explained to her satisfaction that yes, there were two wives, but he had to treat them both equally. At age 10, she had done her own research. At the end of that first summer, John Wickland from the Peace Corps staff office asked me if I would fill a slot for ESL, English as a Second Language, teacher in the Noisy Nest Swan. This was a women's institute that had been set up by members of the royal family for women who did not complete school before getting married. I was delighted to become one of those Americans who rode a bicycle to a Peace Corps assignment. All PCDs had them, even the 70-year-old retired doctor and his wife. We were working in the country without guns, riding bicycles, and were only fearful about the packs of street dogs that roamed at night. Some of the Peace Corps girls carried baseball bats in their bike baskets to scare them off. As I was looking for the entrance the first day, an Afghan woman drove up in a chauffeured limousine. We talked on the steps for a while. She had lived in an apartment in New York City while her husband was at the UN. She loved the convenience. She loved the convenience of New York. Everything so available nearby. But then she lamented, "Oh, I had no time for myself because I had to do all the work myself." Well, I knew that one. She told me that many women came to the Institute to get away from their mothers-in-law or to combat the loneliness of their husbands studying abroad. Her words helped me identify the motley crew I taught, about 20 in all. They ranged in age from the teenager who had just gotten engaged and it had become the policy to move them from the public schools to the Moisey because it was such a distraction from the other girls. The oldest one was a maiden lady who had very sensible shoes and wool skirt and sweater, and with her shadri over the back of her seat. She was the only one in the class who did wear it. One day, a messenger came from the director's office. There was a TV crew from Poland, and they would be coming in shortly. As soon as Miss Miller heard that, she came up to me and said, "Please, please, may I be excused?" And I nodded that it was okay, I got it. She rushed back, got her shadri and her books, and scurried away down the corridor. Although there was no TV in Afghanistan, the thought of someone somewhere seeing her face was just too overwhelming. There was one girl I called the Prime Minister because I thought this girl could be anything in the future. She was obviously very well educated already, didn't need any English lessons, and carried a big bulging bookcase, a book bag full of books. Sometimes I had to use her as a translator because I arrived at school one day and there was no class. So the next day I was slightly put out because, for them it was just power and A's, it doesn't matter. So they wondered why I was upset. So I got her to help me clear that up. I said, well, there are many things I could have done with that time. I could have done things for my own children and so forth. So I was so touched that they did take that in, and forever after, they told me when there was not going to be a class. There were many questions I couldn't answer. One girl wanted to know how she could keep her figure. She said, "You've had 3 children and I've only had 1," but she had absolutely no muscle tone. But I knew from visiting with Peace Corps volunteers that they had a lot of difficulty starting a sports program because the girls didn't want to get out and get sun. But what really bonded us was the day I brought Gregory to class. Afghan schools operated in the summer and closed in the winter when the buildings were too cold. So Gregory's school hadn't started. And so he was used, as the youngest, he'd always been used to going places with me. So he said, could he come to school with me? And I said, okay. I didn't take the bike that day. I took my little VW. And as soon as we walked in, and there was a little clutch, of women chatting together beforehand. This woman grabbed Gregory to her bosom and just stroked him, and the other ladies who were mothers stood around waiting to hug him. And I stood there wondering how was I going to take this. And one woman looked around at me and said, "He's not yours, he's ours." So they really love children. They really love children. And in a country where so many children die early of contagious diseases, they are really treasured. Needless to say, he didn't want to go to school again. One day I took in a Time magazine Walter had brought back. On the cover was a photo of bumper-to-bumper traffic. Because there was one girl who was always despairing because there weren't many cars in Kabul. And I tried to tell her, you know, there's a downside to this. And I showed her the picture, but you know, she just glazed over. She didn't see it. And then I realized that, you know, the paradigm has changed from seeing to believing is believing to believing is seeing. Unless you believe something is possible, you can't see it. Today, one cannot see the sun in Kabul for the polluted haze that comes from vehicles and generators burning diesel fuel. What I loved about my Afghan experience is it took me back to my childhood, growing up on the coast of Maine before World War II, and a world with few automobiles and no TV. Families made their own fun, and in summer there were extended family picnics. Afghans, too, spend long Sundays picnicking. Finally, I connected with an Afghan woman who lived in our neighborhood and began to feel a part of that Afghan community, included in picnics. The Ghazis had many, outside Kabul was a large public gardens, and also there was a section for where families had small private walled gardens. The stream ran through. It was a wonderful place to go in the hot, dusty summer days of Kabul, and I really appreciated that. I tried to remember how I met Fatima. I must have been told about her beauty salon. It was, you got it, behind her compound wall, in the front room of her modest home. In a world with no street signs or house numbers, a little child in the street could take you to your location if you knew the person's name. It was a harbinger of changes in the wind when a dressmaker shop owned and operated by a woman and employing 3 seamstresses opened in the nearby Blue Mosque Bazaar with a window so the seamstresses were visible to the street. Fatima had a marvelous sense of humor. When I passed a stylish woman coming out as I was going in, Fatima laughed and told me that there was a member of the royal family. Everyone in Kabul is related to the royal family but me, she said. Her husband worked in one of the banks and they had spent several years in London. I went down to Pakistan to catch the boat in my shagri, she wanted me to know, which she did not wear anymore, of course. Like a barber shop, a beauty salon is a perfect place to learn about a community. Besides, I liked her. Walter was puzzled about our friendship. I found this a puzzling question until I realized he was living in a parallel universe. He had to deal with dozens of government officials. They all spoke, depending on where they had their advanced education, either French, German, or English, in addition to the local languages in Afghanistan. Walter had been born in Germany, moved to Belgium at age 5, and fled to America at age 10, so he spoke all 3. Many of these officials wanted to learn something from him, wanted something from him. For a while, it was an American secretary. The Peace Corps obliged and sent a few American secretaries to train the first Afghan women who were ready to work outside. But the Afghan officials simply wanted an Afghan secretary for prestige, so they didn't give the American secretaries any chance to train the Afghan women, and they quit. But they still pestered Walter, and he finally said, "I am not running a Kelly Girl agency." I thought of Fatima and myself as the same. Wives, mothers, lovers of dance, outspoken, although she was an entrepreneur and I was not. So finally I told Walter, well, in answer to his question, well, we both came from small, out-of-the-way places and went out to the larger world. When there was no business going on, we hung out. Time in Afghanistan was not like a swiftly rushing river. It was more like a lake that you sat beside or floated on, watching the clouds drift by. When we got back to New Jersey, Catherine was homesick for Afghanistan for a while. She said, the teachers are always telling me to hurry up next year. You're going to high school next year, then you have to hurry up because you'll be going to college. She said, I want to go back to Afghanistan where time doesn't matter. Fatima talked about her own culture shocks in Kabul. In Kabul, every property had its own well. When she and Raouf went to Washington, D.C., they went to a different restaurant every day because they were trying to find one that had good tasting water. But she said they were all the same. They didn't understand that they didn't have wells. It was municipal water. One morning I found her distraught. Her brother lived in Mazar-i-Sharif, even further away than Bamiyan. He was ill and she wanted to go see him, but it was not possible to go alone. I'll go with you, I volunteered. Feeling, of course, we would take the local airline that the volunteers called Inshallah Airline. It would run when God willed it. That won't do. I have to be accompanied by a male relative. Raouf cannot take times off and the boys are having exams. Where we bonded most was through dance. The first time we ate at her home, she hired a drummer. Walter was so consumed with his duties that he had to leave. I can never resist a good beat. It was a small room, but when Fatima began to dance, I joined her and the party became even livelier. It was not the belly dance. Arms were lifted overhead and there was a lot of fast footwork. Her family joined us for our second Thanksgiving in country. The motto on the cover of the Peace Corps cookbook was, from the Old Testament, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? At Fatima's, we always sat on the floor, on the toe shocks on the floor to eat. Our house came with a dining room table that could seat the 10 of us. Our family were members of a Quaker meeting. Quakers have silent grace and are not hymn singers. I was beginning to wonder how to explain this when Fatima piped up, I want to hear the song. I presumed she meant the Thanksgiving hymn. So I hoped that my Jewish husband, who had spent his high school years at Choate and had to go to a chapel every day, had learned it. And I thought Christopher had in school, and he was our one who could carry a tune. We got through it with a lot of grace and love. After our meal, the oldest boy played Afghan songs on a harmonium. Her family sang, and she and I danced. As we whirled around, I noticed two shadows on the silk screen that divided the room into two sections. Anwar Abdulhamid was standing there, watching and listening. I felt that evening totally at home and at peace with my world and myself. We didn't know then that in 3 months' time we would be packing up for our return trip. Our departure date had been moved from June 1st to March, mid-March. Fatima said she was going to cry for 3 days. We canceled our vacation plans, stayed home, and enjoyed the snow. Afghans have a saying, they would rather have snow than gold. The melt from snow in the high mountains is ingeniously channeled downhill, downhill, downhill for irrigation of fields, and also ends up in those ditches beside the road, which are in many places the sole source of water for a village or town. I know because we stayed overnight with a Peace Corps couple that had to go out in the evening and bring in the buckets of water to strain and then boil. The Germans, who had built so many useful things in Kabul, a marble factory and a woolen factory, constructed a ski hut outside town with a rope tow operated by an automobile motor. I was a reluctant skier. I sat in the hut with a bag of sandwiches and was just beginning to unwrap one. The hut was small, with 3 small tables. There were 2 empty seats at mine. The door opened behind me, and 2 young Afghans came in. They were dressed in elegant overcoats. They looked like they might have just returned from London. I invited them to sit down, and almost at that very moment, a young Afghan girl child slid onto my lap and began to eat one of the tuna fish sandwiches. I did the mom thing of sliding my arm around her to better balance her on my knees. And at that moment, a Soviet agent, I had learned to spot them by then, walked over. He did the appropriate thing of not looking at an Afghan woman's face and attempted to engage the young men in conversation. In my first weeks in country when I was so green, I had been targeted myself. In the Cold War, both sides were desperately trying to get someone to defect. The young men's faces were impassive, and I often wondered what happened to them. The agent's last words were, "We want to get you guys a radio." What with being surrounded by those high mountains, one needed a good shortwave radio. It really tickles me that during my last days in Afghanistan, I passed as an Afghan mom. We left just before Eid in the spring, but not before the short spring rain when the dry plains became covered with thousands of wild lilies. Then it was up and away, back to New Jersey. It took us many months to feel integrated into our homeland. Catherine and Chris found they had acquired a worldview they could not share with their peers. Me, I freaked out in the supermarket. I couldn't decide what brand or flavor of ice cream to buy from their large array. Only the youngest, now 8, was undeterred. He asked his father to make him a cassette of slides and gave a presentation to all 3 third grades in his school. Afghanistan never had a better promoter. In 1979, the American ambassador in Kabul was assassinated. The Peace Corps withdrew, and the Russians invaded. During the 80s, several million Afghans left their homeland. Some just to the refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran. They returned at the end of the fighting. The more affluent Afghans dispersed to such far-off places as Australia, UK, Canada, and the United States, and many have not returned. Fatima and her husband and the 2 girls are American citizens now. The girls married American men, one of Afghan origin. The 2 sons stayed in UK and married British women. No one wanted to hear stories about Afghanistan until after 9/11. Then some of us wrote books. Several of the male former Peace Corps volunteers went looking for the old Afghanistan and reported it could still be found far out in the countryside. Several women we know returned to do useful projects with children, widows, and teachers. There was no way to locate Anwar since he had only one name and no address. I thought he appeared to be about 10 years younger than myself, but it was so hard to tell Afghan's age. One morning when I was working near the garden gate and the bell rang, I opened it, and it was like I had stepped into the Old Testament. It was someone standing there on a robe, like, what as they said, the many-colored robe of Jacob's colored robe. In the north, people from the north wore these long robes of brilliant colors, and he had on a turban. And his face was so wise and kindly. And Anwar had heard the bell too and came running down. After what I said, who was that? And he said, old Babe. Well, it turns out that every old gentleman they called an old Babe. So I asked, well, how old is old Babe? And he thought for a while, and then he said, oh, 40 maybe? And I thought, oh my God, I'm 41. But life, you know, with the fierce winds of winter and the scorching winds of summer and the dust storms, people aged very fast, and also all the hard work they did. There was no, so I soon became resolved to the fact that he's probably not alive. Chris created the website and a YouTube for my book, and sometimes I get interesting emails. I become pretty cautious. Shortly after New Year's, I received an email that began, "Salam alaikum to a very kind lady." I wondered what this young man wanted from me. He was writing from Green Mountain College in Vermont. He was an Afghan exchange student from Bamiyan with a dream of building a library in his hometown. I replied, I told him I would make some inquiries, that I had no resources of my own, but I would tell him what I always told my children. In dreams begin responsibility. Honor your dream, take care of your dream, protect your dream, and you will attract the people who can help you. And I said, I send you a mother's prayers and blessings. Several weeks later, I got a reply thanking me for my motherhood prayers and including an attachment with a full report and a budget for the library. Through the many talks he has given in the past 2 years, he has raised most of the money for the building, about $22,000. That's in range with what Greg Mortensen does. A local nonprofit in Bamiyan, started by the Hazaras, is donating the land and contributing in other ways. He is looking now mostly for funds for books and laptops, shelves, desks, and so forth, generator. The library is for his large high school of 4,000 students. What is even more amazing is his story. He was 9 years old in 2001 when he had to run and hide in the mountains from the Taliban, where he says, we lived on grass. Walter, too, Christopher's father, was 10 years old when he had to run from his homeland. His family were among the lucky few who received visas for the United States, signed by Harry Bingham. Walter was the first one I mailed about my wish that as a family we make a donation for those books. On the internet, I discovered an article by a British journalist who visited Bamiyan in the summer of 2008 and wrote a piece about talking with one young man she met there who was eager to read Shakespeare and Chaucer. As an English major, I am really excited about this project. It has been worth the wait for the perfect resolution for my wish and to make a contribution to Anwar's people. One of the most important lessons one needed to learn in Afghanistan was waiting. The language doesn't even have a future tense. Everything is like, tomorrow we do this, inshallah. Next week we'll go there, inshallah. Everything happens according to God's will, inshallah.